Hello, and welcome to Strange Stories with the Seeker and the Skeptic. I'm Brittany Rose, and I am the Seeker.
And I guess that would make me the skeptic. I'm Jonathan. Strange Stories with the Seeker and the Skeptic is a podcast about understanding the unexplained. We want to hear stories from real people who experience real things. With each episode and each interview, we want to have normal people share what they perceive of their experiences, their beliefs, and how that has changed or not.
So, as I said, I'm Brittany Rose, and I consider myself a seeker. And what I mean by that is for the last decade or so, I've been on this spiritual and self-discovery journey. So, I've been trying to just really uncover deeper levels of truth about myself, our existence, and reality. And I've done that through learning about things like Reiki and the Akashic Records. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. So I do a lot of my seeking through that internal exploration. One of the reasons that I'm interested in the unexplained is that I grew up in a haunted house, or perhaps with a haunted sister, which is something that we'll explore in a future episode when we interview my sister, Erin. But all throughout my childhood and adolescence, there was all kinds of crazy things that would happen in my house. I would see things and hear things that just could not be explained. Um, I would hear footsteps going up and down the hallway when no one was there. A lot of times I'd hear like whispering in my ear at night, which was incredibly creepy, or see shadows out of the corner of my eye. That was something that would happen on an almost daily basis. And when I was a teenager, I did see a ghost in my living room. And it was the same ghost my sister had been seeing since she was a small child. Um, so I've always just been kind of curious about this stuff. I'm not going to lie. A lot of those experiences growing up really freaked me out, to the point where my sister and I, until she went away to college, we would sleep in the same room together because we were scared. Um, but aside from being freaked out, I was fascinated. I spent a lot of time studying witchcraft when I was a teenager, and then I kind of fell away from that. And then as an adult, I fell into Reiki, and it was something that really helped me with things like anxiety and my mental health at the time. So that's kind of the path that I have been following on my journey as a seeker. And so now Jonathan's going to talk about his journey as the skeptic.
Yeah, well, I think probably the first thing to really confront here is what skeptic means in the context that we're talking about. I don't mean skeptic in the context that I think that people generally are being dishonest when they say they have stories. I think that people, lots of people, have had things happen to them throughout their lives, or maybe just once in their life, that have changed how they have to view reality in some way or another. And we all look at it under different lenses. And, you got the limitations of the English language, limitations of, the subcultures that we come from. Um, Lots of different, things can shade these things for us. So I don't doubt that people who say they have seen or experienced things have. I do doubt a lot of the overarching themes that we as a culture try to apply to these things. I don't necessarily um, fall under any specific religious affiliation or creed. I think most of that is, pretty provably um, made up as you look through, actual history and records. You can pretty much disprove lots of things that the, quote, established culture tries to tell us about things like that. So, that's kind of where my skepticism is whenever we try to put these things into a box. My thought process is more John Keel's thought process of a lot of these things seem to be somewhat connected to one another, somewhat related to each other, very cyclical. If you go through history, you see these cycles of similar types of things happening um, to different types of people all through time. And that's kind of more my thought process of I don't doubt the people we're going to be speaking to, but I doubt a lot of how we would try to frame it as a people. My experiences with quote unexplained phenomenon go far, far back through my life. I'm 42 now. Um, One of my first experiences that I can recall, not the first one, but pretty close, was in Lumberton, North Carolina. It would was the end of my first grade school year, so that would have been 1987. Um, my father would have been at work. He was a night manager for a pizza joint, so he closed a lot. He worked till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning as a rule at that time. My mom had three small sons. I was seven. I was the oldest, and then my brothers were well, they would have been 2 and 3. She at that point, um, I don't believe at that point she was working, and I think it's because you got 3 kids. They probably would have paid out more for childcare than they would have actually made. It's one of those situations. Lumberton was and is a small town in rural central North Carolina. It's pretty well known for having a depressed economy and for strange disappearances and lights in the sky, even to this day. This particular night, towards the end of that first grade school year, it was dark. It was nighttime. I think get the feeling that it was just before mine and my brother's bedtime, which would have made it probably between 8 and 8:30. We were little kids. And what I remember is this: um, we were in our living room. It was a 2-story house, and we were all in our living room. And my mom was agitated. She kept going through the living room like she was looking for something, like something was going on. It was very obvious something was wrong. And my brothers and I, and we're just little kids. We're just trying to figure out, how do we help mom be less upset? What's going on? And she stands up, she looks around, and she says, "Something is wrong. We have to get out of the house." So she makes us put on their shoes. And we start going towards the door. And I remember kind of vaguely thinking, I don't know where we're going to go. Dad's got the car. And he did because he was working. He worked a lot, trying to make ends meet. And we get to the door. She opens the door and she gets us out the door. We get onto the porch. It had a kind of a semi-enclosed front porch in this building. And we look at the front yard and there's an owl in midair, but not mid-flight. It was kind of oriented to where its face was towards us. Its body was down, and its wings were spread out wide, which is not the stance that you would expect an owl to have taken. It was larger than any owl I've seen in real life, and it was brown. And there's times when my memory says that its eyes were red, and there's times when my memory says its eyes were green. And I blinked, and when I opened up my eyes again, we were back in the house. We were sitting on our couch, which was an old hand-me-down couch that my mom honestly hated. She never liked that couch. We got rid of it shortly after this experience, but she never sat on that couch. She never would have done that on purpose. Anyway, she had her own chair. She liked my mom. She liked her chair, and she did not like the couch. And so she would not have chosen to sit there. But going from left to right, my mom and then me and then Rick, my middle brother, and my youngest brother, Ed, we're just sitting quietly and silently on the couch. So we just kind of blinked to look around. And my mom said, "Where did this hour go?" Or something along those lines. I was a little kid. I'm 42 now. So The words are not going to be word for word. And apparently, I asked her years later, and I asked her about this a few times over the years. And there's times that she remembers this memory, and there's times that she doesn't remember what I'm talking about at all, which is interesting in and of itself. But when she does remember it, she remembers that hour being lost. And this is just a thing that was never explained to me. I've always wondered what would happen if someone tried to hypnotize me to see what I would see of that memory with today's thought process. But yeah, that's one of my first experiences with something that cannot be readily explained, easily explained, and kind of colored my perception of a lot of things to this day for the rest of my life.
Like how so? How did it color your perceptions?
Well, I mean, time is trackable. Even especially as a kid, you learn things, and like as you're learning things as a kid, you're learning how reality works. You learn letters, and letters form words, and words form sentences, and sentences form communication, and that's how we get the things that we need. When that's how we communicate our desires and the things we need. Well, numbers add up and subtract, and then there's other theoretical things that you learn later on, or you don't. Some people skip math. I don't know, but when it really comes down to it, time generally is a thing that we can kind of rely on, at least on a moment to moment, day to day basis, to be pretty much what we expect it to be. And at 7, that perception that was still forming in my brain, I was struggling to get analog clocks, but I had gotten digital clocks really well. So I understood how time was supposed to work. And especially as a little kid, it's linear. It's like 8:21, 8:22, 8:23. It does not go 8:12, 9:13. Even as a kid, I knew that. And so it made me more likely, I think, to question a lot of things. And I have my entire life.
Hmm. Do you have any theories about what happened?
Well, over the years, I've read hundreds and hundreds of books and articles and stories, and listened to radio stations and podcasts, and watched films and documentaries, and talked to a crazy number of people about all kinds of things. And the only people that have experiences that I feel are comparable go from one of two camps. Um, and about half of those people are people who have uh, close encounter experiences with UAPs and what may or may not be inside of UAPs. And the other half of those people are people who have been hypnotized and had a memory kind of integrated into their minds to mask another memory. And those are the only people that have experienced things that I've come across that come close to what, and that's one of the reasons why always been curious and somewhat concerned as to what would happen if I did kind of submit to hypnotherapy. I do think something happened. I've spent my life remembering this, and again, sometimes my mom remembers it, sometimes it doesn't. I do know that my father has passed a few years ago, but about 10 years ago, I asked him if he remembers. I was telling him about that when I was a kid, and he kind of got a little weird, and he's like, "Yeah, I remember that you guys were really upset and said something happened." He's like, "I never really disbelieved what it was, but I never experienced any of the stuff that you guys experienced when you were growing up. There was so much of it, and I was never really part of any of that." he the and him, you know, he was a skeptic in a very different way. He was so religious that he didn't think anything could be possible past the things he believed religiously. And so
Mm,
for him to say that he didn't discount that things were happening, he just didn't have any real context for it, was always kind of interesting to me, because he was the
mm.
first person to kind of try to, you know, to stop people talking about stuff like that. He, he mostly considered it to be silly.
I think that's an interesting thing that we should talk about. We both grew up in pretty religious homes. I grew up with a family whose, faith is Catholicism. Your family's was very Christian. Um, I feel like for me, not that I align with Christian faith, but I feel like having that background maybe made me a little bit more open as a seeker, and in terms of trying to figure out what was right for me and what fit in with my worldviews. How do you think your religious background has influenced you as like the skeptic?
Well, something that's weird about that for me was the types of churches that my parents went to and took us to, because you go where you're a kid, you go where your parents tell you to go. They take you to church, you go to church. They don't take you to church, you don't go to church. They take you to the store, you go to the store. And so my parents were real big into this church down in Lumberton, and we were in Lumberton for about 6-ish years, somewhere in there, in that area at least of Lumberton. And this was an early-ish evangelical church. Um, their leader was definitely um, would have fit the profile of a cult leader if he had, had a compound of some kind. As in, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like a cult or like the Branch Davidians, but definitely he was a I am the voice of God today on earth, at least one of them, and you should listen to the things that I say. And some of the stuff that he believed was some you can trace from the Bible. Some of it was kind of you know, at the time that they called it prosperity gospel, but they really took a lot of ideas from what I would call and there's not quote new age is not really a real thing. Like, these people made up the new age name as something to be a boogeyman, but what they called that, they took a lot of ideas from stuff that eventually became called, manifesting, stuff like that. Um, they took that and put God's name on it, basically, and they said, if you pray enough, God will give you a Mercedes. If you pray enough, God will pay your light bill. If you pray enough, God will keep you healthy. He'll take you out of that wheelchair. He'll let you throw your glasses away. That's the type of people. And these people were very, very convinced that the book of Revelation was very literal, very real, and they believed in dispensationalism. They believed in the rapture, a literal rapture, and they were counting on that happening any day now. In 87, they said it was going to be in 90, and 90, they said it was going to be in 94. Um, and they were very sincerely convinced that this is where this was going to be. And so there were a lot of guest speakers and guest preachers that would come in and out, and they would all have different ideas of what the book of Revelation meant, what the Bible meant, what all these things were. And none of them gelled, and none of the adults seemed to notice or seemed to mind. But as a kid who, for whatever reason, I've always questioned everything, I started kind of taking notes as to what these people were saying and how they didn't add up. And so that kind of forced me as an observant person, who was frankly bored through most of this church stuff. I mean, it was not kid friendly, really. It was droning on, and I had nothing to do but think. And by the time I was 10 or 11, I had come up with a bunch of things that were very, very much not fitting together in what all these people believed. And that framework has kind of follow me through my life is, I always look at every situation in a framing of, you know, is this real? Is this correct? Are these people, I mean, what's actually happening here? It's gotten me into a lot of interesting conversations throughout my life. One of the things that we definitely would like to focus on with, especially this first episode, and letting you all as listeners get to know us a little bit and see where we're coming from, is what we've been talking about. Is this framework of where did we get, how did we get to where we are, as far as things we believe, things we don't believe. And I think that for Brittany, um, a lot of that comes from the idea, the practice, and the process of channeling a higher self. And I think that's kind of where we should go next on this short explanation of who and what we really are.
So in probably it was 2013. I was just kind of starting my spiritual exploration journey. And I just discovered that I was an empath. I had somebody explain to me, what it meant to be an empath, that I could feel everybody else's emotional energy, that I was absorbing everybody else's emotional energy. And it was like something clicked and my whole existence was explained to me in that moment. I knew that these things were happening, but I didn't know how to put it into words. So that kind of propelled me forward of like, okay, so now I know this about myself. Now I need to do something about that. So I was very new on this journey and getting more in tune with myself and my spiritual self and all of that. And there was a job opportunity for me that was something a company I really wanted to work for. It was kind of like my dream job at the time. But what they were offering me was only part-time work. And I really wanted to like make this happen. I wanted to give up my full-time job, give up all my benefits, and work for this company. But I was stressed about it because it was going to be a big pay cut. I was going to have insurance. So even though it was the right company, it in a lot of ways felt like the wrong position. So one day I was just going about my business. I think I was cleaning and I felt this presence come over me where I don't, unless you've ever channeled before, it's kind of hard to describe it, but it's just like kind of like this being imbued with an energy. And I knew I needed to like pick up a pen, pick up a piece of paper, and just start writing. And I did. And what I wrote, I knew it was coming from like a deeper place than just me, just my conscious mind. It was coming from someplace else. And what I wrote was, do not take the job as it is. If you wait, you'll get the right job with the right circumstances. And I was like, holy, like it just felt so true to me. And so I made the decision that I was going to turn the job down, even though I really wanted it, and just kind of trust this guidance that I was given. And a month later, I got a phone call offering me a job with this company full time with benefits. So that guidance really kind of took me to the next level of opening up to my spiritual self. Some people call it your higher self or your authentic self. But that's how I see it, is that there's this part of me that exists in a different level of consciousness that is there to help guide me, to help me with healing. But in that circumstance, it definitely guided me in the right direction in such a profound way. And I think what's going to be interesting for us, we're a couple, we've been together for a little over a year now. But I feel like there's going to be a lot of new stories that come out for both of us because I think I've told you part of that story, but I don't think I've told you the whole part of me like channeling a message.
No, you kind of did mention that part before.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean that's part of why we want to do this. We were learning things about people, hopefully learning some things about how the universe actually works, learning
hmm
things about ourselves and each other. I mean, as I go through and think about these experiences I've had, especially as a kid and as a teenager, things are kind of coming into more focus for me. I mean, I'm 42. A lot of these memories are 30 years old, and a lot of things that happened to you as a kid, you think about in terms of the context that you have, which is just a limited worldview because you've had limited experiences. Well, I've had a lot less limits of my experiences as what I would hope most adults. And so as we grow and get older, and we figure things out better. At least that's the hope. Some people do, some people don't. Another thing that we're going to do as these episodes progress is, as people have told their stories, and we ask them questions and clarify and try to get as much info as we can about the things that are happening to these people, so that you, the listener, can make up your own mind as to what you think is happening, is not happening. Anytime there's something that has happened to these folks that goes with or even opposite of the things that we've experienced, we're going to mention those things. So you folks are going to be learning more about us as we learn about each other and ourselves as well.
For sure. What do you think about the story I just told? Put it in your perspective.
Well, I think a lot of things. On one level, I think that whether we admit it or not, we humans are pretty good, if we let ourselves be, at knowing what our odds are of something working out or not. You know, we kind of downplay. I think we downplay common sense. I believe that there's more to common sense than we think it is. We just we kind of write that off. We write off things like what people call intuition. We write that off. And I think that if you're willing to listen to what your brain thinks, not just that surface thought, but what's going on in your subconscious. If you're willing to listen to that, you know more than you think you do. And is there a spiritual component to that? Who am I to say one way or another? I do not know. I'm not sure how you want to. It also depends on how you want to define the word spiritual. Um, do I think that you were told in your brain those things? I absolutely do. Uh, do I attribute that to a spiritual being outside of you? Not necessarily. For me, my experiences, things the way I understand things, it would be more a part of your own psyche is telling you this thing, and you're correct. You're also a smart person. You had a lot of information about it. You probably had an idea that maybe another experience or another opportunity with that company would come to you. And so your brain told you, hey, hang on, man, give it some time. These people are going to want you for a better situation a little ways down the road. And you were correct. That being said, I've seen too many people in my life have, what you can only really describe as precognitive ability that I can't help but assume or expect that there is some amount of that in your situation as well. But I would also, to me, would still attribute that more to the person than something outside of the person.
So I don't see my spiritual self as outside of me. I see it as a different level of consciousness that is very much me, but we are sometimes don't have that clear channel open for that communication. I don't see it as a separate entity. I see it almost as the most authentic part of me.
Fair enough. And that definitely makes sense. I would be more likely to attribute that to something that I would something outside of you as a person, for sure. I don't know that what we're saying is necessarily at odds with one another.
Mhm. I agree. It's just, I think we just, and I think that's true a lot of times in our conversations that we just have different words and different ways of conceptualizing these things, and we explain it in a different way, but we're almost talking about the same thing a lot of times.
Yeah, our contexts are very different, and language is sometimes very limiting, and context is limiting too.
Hmm. You guys can't see, but Jonathan just stuck his tongue out at me, so I returned the favor.
We'll probably cut that part out, but maybe not.
Maybe not.
Depends on what our editor wants to do with it. So going forward after this episode, what we're going to be doing is getting into our interviews. Each episode that we produce is going to feature a different person with a different type of experience. They're going to give it to us in their own words. But there's a little bit of direction in how this works, and that we have asked them a short questionnaire about the types of things that has happened to them. One of the things that we are curious about in reference to the people that we are going to be speaking to and with each other is what, if anything, because some people just don't want to know more, but what, if anything, do you want to know more about the things that you have gone through? It could be a different context. It could be just a reason. It could be uh, whether or not you're alone in it. Like what there, I feel like we feel like everyone has questions. Okay.
I have so many questions. So many questions. So, some of my questions, especially growing up in what I would consider to be a haunted house, um, some of the spiritual activity seemed like there was a consciousness with it and very interactive, and some of it felt like it was kind of an imprint of energy and just like a replaying of a scene. So I want to understand that. Like, why are some, you know, ghost encounters, either there's conscious energy or maybe not so much. Um, and I think a lot of times you hear people in the spiritual community talking about like the veil. And there's certain times a year, especially in October where the veil is thinner. What does that mean exactly? What is the veil? Why is it thinner in some places than other places, or other times? And is that how perhaps aliens are coming through, through these veils or thin areas in between the dimensions. So those are some of the questions I have about my own personal experiences, but just in general, like I'm constantly questioning the nature of reality and how all of this works. And I don't know if we will ever have the answers to that, but that's the seeker in me. I just want to know. I want to understand. So what are some of the questions you have?
Well, I mean, realistically, what parts of these experiences are connected, what parts aren't? Why is it that one person in one area at one time frame can have what they would consider to be, for example, a saucer experience, and then 2 weeks later, the next town over, someone sees what would be described as maybe a Bigfoot sighting. If you look at flaps of UFO encounters, you also see flaps of Bigfoot sightings and men in black who may or may not be real or may or may not have been made up. So I think some of the stories are and some of them are not. And I think sometimes the people messing with people, and sometimes it's just something we just don't have the real answers to. Um, not to continue to harp on one given thing, but again, I'm more in the John Keel school of thought of things being indirectly connected and very cyclical. I think that he would have liked the idea of our planet being a potentially broken cloud computing instrument, and
Mhm.
it's just
Yeah.
cycling through a same. He called it the broken phonograph in the sky, but really it would be more of like an operating system trying to boot itself up over and over and over again and gets to a certain point and then it just starts over and blue screens of death, blue screens of death. And, that seems more likely to me than 17 different kinds of quote unexplained phenomenon happening on the same planet at the same time.
Neil deGrasse Tyson said something similar about, this all being just a computer game or a simulation of some sort, which is something that's definitely stuck with me. But I want to go back to a couple of things he said. First of all, I hope we get a Bigfoot person. I hope we have somebody come on this show who has had a Bigfoot sighting because
Oh
I
yeah, me
just
too. I want to have that conversation. 100%.
definitely want to have that conversation. And the second thing, can you explain for people who might not know what do you mean by flaps?
Basically, in context of UFOs slash UAPs slash whatever the buzz acronym of the day is, a flap, quote flap, FLAP flap, is any group or cluster of sightings of the similar type in the same time frame in the same geographical region. An example of which would be in the late 60s in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, there was a like a 16-month time frame where everybody and their uncle saw something in the sky one way or another. It was different things for different people, different times. Um, it seems like, no three people had the same story, but there is basically a group of sightings over a time frame in a geographical region. John Keel is a name you're going to hear from me quite a lot. He was a journalist out of New York City. He came into prominence in the 60s and 70s. We started investigating unexplained things in the 50s, 1950s. He was the first person to, on a national scene, talk about the Mothman sightings in West Virginia. He wrote the book, The Mothman Prophecies, which very much began to help popularize the idea of things like UFOs, like the Mothman, like cryptids. He didn't make up that word, but he was one of the first people to report on things like that in a very serious way. Um, he traveled the world. He did a lot of research. He talked to a lot of people. He read a lot of things, and ended up with this theory that, again, he called the Great Phonograph in the Sky, that all of these things are happening to people. None of it is anything like what we think it is, and it's been happening forever. If you look in the Old Testament and the Bible, you have UFO stories, you have ghost stories, you have what you could potentially consider to be at least one Men in Black encounter, where the strangers come in and warn Lot to get out because it's going to get bad. There's lots of things. You have at least one alien abduction in the Old Testament. If you look in ancient Indian writings, and especially their art, ancient art in India, I mean, you talk about UFOs, there's UFOs in those paintings. And he was the first person to point and say, hey, guys, look at this too. These are the things, at least on that global scale. He was mostly influenced by this guy named Charles Fort. And most of the types of things that we're going to cover are considered Fortean, like as in like Fort, like Fortean. And he was a British journalist in the late 1800s who did a lot of stories about, at that time, there were a lot of flying machines like Zeppelins being sighted throughout the world. Well, the Zeppelins didn't exist yet. They were, kind of a theory in a couple of people's minds, but no one had figured out how to get them in the sky. But people were seeing flying ships. And as our technology has changed, what these things seem to be doing and saying have changed as well. They've evolved with us. And, where Keel came in was maybe they're evolving with us because they're part of us, because they're part of the nature of this planet. We just don't understand it. And, I've read everything he's ever published and some stuff that was published by other people that he wrote posthumously. There's a, you know, if there is something I align with as far as belief goes, it's the guidelines that he set forth.
Another difference between us is that Jonathan has done a lot more reading and research on the unexplained than I have. My my research has been a lot of like internal. exploration, and yours has definitely been more of the external exploration. So there's definitely a lot of differences there, but um, I'm very much interested in reading, some things that John Keel's written, and doing a little bit more of that exploration. And John's been reading a book on the Akashic Records, so he's kind of coming over a little bit more into my realm too and exploring that. So different things for both of us to look into to just kind of expand our knowledge and our perspectives, I think.
Well, life is about learning. And so, that's just another thing that we wanted to start this for is, there's people with experiences that are wildly different than ours.
Hmm.
And just because those experiences are different does not mean that they're not valid. And there doesn't seem to be a space anywhere that people are putting out the idea of people just telling their stories without trying to connect anything to anything or without trying to prove true or false. Just a safe space for people who have had things that don't fit into the general American mold of what the world's supposed to look like.
Definitely. So that's what we have for you for today. I think that this is going to be a very fun conversation to continue with other people. So really looking forward to start getting some interviews done and putting out some episodes for you guys. Um, if you're interested in talking to us, you can email us at seekerandskeptic@gmail.com. Just give us kind of a little preview of the story that you want to tell, and then we will email you back with a questionnaire and get you set up for an interview. Um, but looking forward to continuing this conversation and see you next time. Bye.
Bye, guys.